start by saying, when we were asked to do this, my first discussion with Daksha was that, I don't know too much about this topic. And, I'd love to actually be part of a discussion where we could, find some useful input, not only to kind of educate ourselves and broaden our perspectives, but also just, get a discussion going on what are things that we really need to know and be aware of as we, go ahead and integrate in just all the right sense of the word, this community into the larger community, be it your workplace or your families, your friends, society at large. So, I'm just going to keep that lens. So I'm a novice and I'd love to, know more from all three of you. With that, let me just kind of have a bunch of questions that I thought we could use to get this discussion going. So not really going to say, which one of you should answer, but just your collective vision. We'd love to have your points on, how you think, what your opinions are about these particular questions. So jumping right in, while we were discussing this, I think there's a lot of the narrative which, has been where things, when they don't fit into this, heterosexual framework, we consider them not normal and something that, requires quote unquote fixing. So, and there's so much like in terms of even medical practices like conversion therapies, etc., which are still practiced, unfortunately. So I'd love, your thoughts to know, to share about, what are some of the things that you have seen happen, and essentially because of a lack of knowledge, understanding, or just even lack of research in this space. And then, perhaps the second part of it, what can we do to actually compensate for the multiple years of, various overt and covert traumatic experiences people in this community have had, especially in India. So that would really be my first question. Open to any one of you would like to get started.
I'm happy to jump in if that's okay.
Sure, sure, Rishi, go for it.
Um, so I do agree, that this what we kind of term as heteronormativity, which is just the assumption that everybody is heterosexual. This is an assumption by individuals and by organizations, institutions, which does a lot of harm. Because for various reasons, it's such a complex issue, which I think, it's wonderful that there are more discussions around this happening so that people can get a more in-depth understanding of it. But this is something where, when we often talk about how can we undo the harm that has been done by decades of what I would actually call malpractice.
Yeah.
So I don't think there is any undoing there. I think, what we can do is acknowledge that, this is what has happened, and taking onus for it. Something that I really, really appreciated, that came out with, I think, one of the justices, Indu Malhotra, when she
Yeah.
read Section 377, and she actually said that, history owes an apology to the LGBT community. That was, I think, one of the first times that a person in a position like that and an institution like the Supreme Court is actually apologizing for, the decades of discrimination and harm that has been done. I
Yeah.
think that is what is actually needed, to just acknowledge what historically has happened, and then, striving to do better as we move on. And
Yeah.
I think the way forward is actually just in, sort of raising awareness, and sensitizing people that, this is not something that is abnormal. This is not something, it's not an illness. It is not something that requires fixing. um, so this is what the way I look at it. And from a mental health perspective, or from let's say from a health professional's perspective, right, we have historically we've kind of followed what is the biomedical model,
Yeah.
which usually places or typically has placed the burden of illness onto individuals. That this illness is something that is because of your inherent biology. And when we look at sexuality as a whole as something that is an illness, then that's kind of where
Yeah.
the problem has started. There's this very very wonderful TED talk by he's a psychologist based in the US. His name is Travis Heath, and he's done a TED talk on self care. I think it's titled "Self Care to Communities of Care," where he talks about this. Of how acknowledging that our health and well-being is made up of so many different components, and how our environment, how our psychosocial environment also impacts that, and how we need to address that, because that is the root where it is coming from.
Right.
uh yeah, so I
Yeah,
think
no, that's a great start to the discussion, Rishi. Richa, anything to add from your perspective?
Yes. All right. So I think I do agree with a lot that Rishi kind of already mentioned. And I think when we are talking about LGBTQ individuals in the country, and as mental health practitioner, I look at myself and the work that I do coming from a social justice lens, because I think that when we're talking about the oppression in the country, whether it is patriarchy, whether it is how everything is so heteronormative in approach, how
Yeah.
everything is about man and woman, and like everything starts and ends at that pretty much. So I think as professionals, we really need to start having a social justice lens. And um, I think one more thing that I really agreed with Rishi there is, if we can, I mean, there's no undoing here, because a lot has happened and it has created a lot of trauma in, individuals who identify as LGBTQ. But if you can own up to whatever that's happening and be mindful when you are interacting with LGBTQ individuals. So I think that's very important. So I would look at anybody to be able to start advocating in your own capacity. Everybody does not have to go on the street like protest, but in your own ways, in your own capacity, whatever it is that you could do, whether you're in a school, college, workspace, anywhere. So I think that's a good place to kind of begin.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, we always kind of feel like we externalize the onus of this to some, vague third party, and it's like, okay, this is not my problem. But I think each of us, doing our bit, as you said, is going to be adding up to, making a big dent in how we look at this, and kind of normalizing it more than anything else. Beth, any thoughts from you?
Thank you. So I think on this question, I'd really defer to the healthcare professionals. But just to add, I would say that I agree absolutely with Rishi that acknowledging what's happened is fundamental. But also focusing on moving forward, how we can make sure that progress continues. I think sometimes there's an assumption that progress will just happen by itself, but there's always a risk of kind of going backwards as well, or just staying stationary.
Yeah.
And I think with COVID and the kind of new circumstances we're in, I know a lot of my friends in the community have said they've lost a lot of support networks they maybe had before, or they find it more difficult to access those networks. And that is the same for the workplace as well. So it's about how we continue to move forward whilst, definitely acknowledging the suffering that people have gone through. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Actually, I'm going to use that point that Beth brought up to get to the next question, which is really about how we look at this in the whole COVID framework, right? Given that so much has changed for how we are working, our support structures have kind of turned on their heads. Any suggestions from the panel on how do you think this whole COVID scenario has impacted, both the support that we give the LGBTQ community, but also, what are the additional ways, or maybe, some new ways that you might have seen or probably have been thinking about that we can use to support mental health, especially in this new kind of new normal workplace where most of us are not actually going to work. We're all a remote and a virtual kind of community. So let's actually talk about that next. And Beth, since you brought this up, maybe we can start with you, and then Richa and Rishi.
Sure. So I think that one thing I'm really conscious of is just putting more focus than before on people's welfare and well-being. Wherever you are, whoever you are, this is a weird and stressful time. And of course, if you're from a group that's already marginalised, it's an even more challenging time for you. So I think the focus on welfare and well-being, and from my perspective, that is very much focused in the workplace in my role. We need to spend more time on that than we've ever spent on this before, and that includes making sure there's really clear processes and structures for people to get help. So we have mental health first aiders, we also have first response officers, and we make sure that people in those groups are from a diverse range of backgrounds, communities, genders, etc., to make sure people can reach out to them and feel comfortable doing so. So I think it's really, really important to make it clear what the processes and structures are for people to get help if they need it. But also just calling people more, video calling people more, making sure people don't get forgotten about, and especially given that people's home environment, for everyone, it's not a safe space or a happy space. And I think people sometimes forget that, and I think that there are opportunities for working from home, including for the community, and for many of people it will feel like a calmer, safer space, but there are others who are in family situations where maybe their parents don't know about their sexuality or what have you, or they're not, they don't feel supported at home, they've lost contact with their the families they've chosen for themselves. And so for me in the workplace, my role really is to make sure that when people are at work, regardless of who they are, they feel like they have support and guidance from a diverse enough range of people. So I'm just focused on amplifying that effort, increasing that effort, spending more and more time on the phone, checking in with people, because it's not going away, right? And it's still hard. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Beth. That's very useful. Richa, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think so when the pandemic actually happened and came into India in March and everybody had to go into a lockdown, I don't think anybody was pretty much prepared for it, and we didn't realize how things are going to pan out for a lot of us who identify as LGBTQ. And so since March till now, I have shifted all my practice online, and there have been different kinds of situations, whether it has been just mental health counseling or it has been managing crisis situations. People are stuck in queerphobic families. You can't really step out of home because then your physical health is at danger, but staying indoors, your mental health is at risk. So it has been a very tricky situation. I know my clients who've actually called me from inside the bathroom, from the terrace, because you don't really have the space to be able to talk to a therapist because nobody really appreciates mental health in the first place. So it's also difficult to be able to talk about your identity. I know so many people have been, like a lot of trans, non-binary people have also been experiencing a lot of dysphoria because they cannot really express their gender the way they'd like to. And, all of these things together can make it really difficult. And I think if you're looking at what is it that we can do, I think shifting everything digitally has anyway been, it's going on. It has started creating more digital spaces for queer individuals where they can, access, whether it's a support group, whether it's an event like this where we're talking about LGBTQ related issues, where whoever is watching this would be like, okay, theek hai. They're talking about something that I might relate to be honest. And I think it's also important that we look at spaces that are also accessible, because I think accessibility can always be an issue. And sometimes affordability is so much of an issue, because I know so many young people who cannot afford therapy, and that can be really tricky. And that's where I think a lot of helplines who also provide queer affirmative therapy is a good area. So I think these are a couple of things that other, additionally to what Beth has already spoken about, because I think she did make some really important points there.
Yeah. No, and this resonates so much. Like I was just recollecting about 12 days ago, I, received a call from somebody who's part of this community and because of COVID had to go back to their hometown in Bihar. And was literally like, standing on the terrace of their house and, speaking to me in whispers, like family won't understand. I really need to talk to someone. So, I mean, what you said, it just hits home so hard because, it's a really uniquely isolating time, especially if the home front is not, is not a safe space, as you say. So, Rishi, your thoughts on this?
I mean, there's nothing additionally to add. Honestly, they've covered most of what I wanted to say. But it's the way I look at this whole COVID situation it's kind of been a mixed bag, because one part of it has been the lack of safe spaces and the isolation and all of this that I think collectively everyone is feeling to some extent or the other. And but at the same time I do also see like Richa was saying, the online space is kind of opened up where if there are talks or there is stuff happening somewhere in the US or somewhere wherever in the world that you do have access to it. So I feel like the way forward also, or something that we can actively look at doing right now, is creating online, whether like Richa was saying, support groups or just spaces where people can sort of be themselves, even if home is not safe.
Right, right. No, ma'am, that, these, I'm just also parallelly taking notes because there's so much food for thought in this discussion. I just wanted to shift gears a little bit and, bring the discussion to focus really on, awareness of mental health professionals, especially, when it comes to the very unique queer issues. And like, what's your opinion on what could be done to actually shift the focus of, the training for mental health professionals, just, to what we referenced earlier as a purely biomedical model, to just, also consider the very unique life stressors and the psychosocial factors for the queer community. And, for that, maybe if, Richa, I could start with you, would be super helpful.
Sure, no, absolutely. I think that's such an important question, because I bring this up every time during a panel, that I did my master's in clinical psychology, and trust me, the only information that I received on LGBTQ has been that, oh, this was, a disorder, and now it isn't anymore, and like that's it. We don't really care much about what happens if you are actually meeting somebody who identifies LGBTQ, and what kind of support you can offer to somebody. What does it mean to be queer affirmative in your practice? None of it was actually really introduced to us. So I think it's so important that queer affirmative practices are a part of our physical, are is a part of the technical education training, which I don't know how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen. But if not, even if professionals, I think every professional should find it in them to kind of update themselves. Go and do a training, maybe read up, anything that you could do to to understand what it is, what does it mean to be a queer affirmative practitioner. Because the client who's coming and meeting you, okay, whether it's virtually or whether it's in person, you cannot assume that this is a heterosexual sitting in person, sitting in front of you, or it's a
Hmm.
cisgender sitting in front of you. And I think as a practitioner, if you with your practice, you need to be able to handle all kinds of cases. And I'll tell you, like, even in my entire batch of my masters in SNDT, there's nobody else who actually works in this area and supports. And that's when I say that, that's we're like very few people who's actually providing counseling to LGBTQ individuals. And I think that's really problematic, because I know many people who would come to me and tell me that I've had a very bad experience before this, and that has also like made them not want to approach therapy anymore. It has made them, it has also put them through a lot of trauma. It is a very, very difficult situation. So as much as we're talking about mental health in the country, which is anyway considered a taboo, this
Yeah.
adds as a layer, because there aren't too many queer affirmative practitioners in the country.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I feel like even for, very, I mean, very basic mental health issues are, we're still riding that, wave of making them feel more acceptable to discuss, seek help for, and, normalizing it. So just this overlay of being from the community, which there's not much research, at least in India, or like a deep understanding. It's just so important to get this right. Rishi, I noticed you were, nodding a lot to what Richa was saying. Love to hear from you next.
Thank you, thank you. So, what I think is that, when you say if what is the level of awareness in mental health practitioners, I think there's a big gap over there. And what is important to understand, that these are systemic issues, right? So the mental health practitioners themselves are brought up and conditioned in the same system. So when we look at heteronormativity, when we look at patriarchy, when we look at these systems around us, the same thought process is something that they have also been conditioned with, which actually requires actively unlearning some of those messages, some of those ideas, and relearning a more affirmative approach. And I mean, just to kind of give an example, I personally know people who have, and I'm not even talking about mental health here. I'm talking about, so if I can just give a short example of, somebody I know who is a young woman who was in a relationship and got pregnant and went to a gynecologist that, this is something that's happened, and I need to kind of have an abortion, and you're usually met with a look of contempt, or this sort of very judgmental look that,
Yeah,
oh, please come in with your husband, or please come in with your family. And I feel like that is not the role a health professional is supposed to be playing. You're not a moral police. You're That's not your job.
absolutely.
So many of these things are so interconnected, which I feel like this is where it needs to shift. And from a
Hmm.
mental health perspective also, if you look at the medical textbooks, in which budding psychiatrists and people are trained, there are, up to I think few years ago, if you look at the medical textbook, there are actively homophobic, or the way in which sexuality is portrayed is very, very problematic. So there is change that needs to happen on multiple levels, and it's not a very easy thing to do.
Yeah, yeah. No, but I would also say like nothing worth doing is actually ever easy, but just discussions and kind of making small changes, but then just kind of moving the whole agenda forward. I think that that's how this is going to go, and I think each of those small steps is super important to to get us up the curve to normalizing this and making this a equitable community.
Absolutely.
Beth, especially from your work on mental health as aid, what's your thoughts on this?
So just to build on what Rishi said, really, I think that the whole process needs to be supportive. So if someone approaches me in the office as a mental health first aider with a concern, and they're from the community and they want to speak to a professional, for example, then I put them in touch with someone who is maybe not open to supporting that person, then obviously that process is going to be a bad experience for the member of staff that has approached me. So I think it's right what Rishi says, the whole kind of system and the whole like process is interconnected and needs to be thought about. And I think the more vocal everyone is, the better. You know, so if I know that there's a really vocal practitioner who's clearly very affirmative, then that's great, because then I can approach them. Similarly, in the office, I think it's really important that people are open and vocal, particularly leadership. So we're really fortunate in our office because even though we're not in the office anymore, we do have people from the community who are open about that, and some of those are members of our mental health kind of support network. On broader mental health, I'm very open. Like, I get quite anxious sometimes, and I'll just say, like, I've just had like a nightmare speech, and like I feel so stressed out, I just need to go and like sit down, and I'll just say that in front of anyone. And on broader issues as well, like on issues around gender, around menstruation, whatever it is, like I'll just carry like stuff around the office, so you know, everyone can see it, great, like people, you know. So I think I'm coming at it from a perspective of someone obviously in a very different position to a lot of people, being like from where I'm from, obviously, etc. So maybe I feel more empowered to be able to behave, you know, to do that and be really open than others might. And I definitely appreciate that. But I just think in general, the more open we can be, the more open leadership can be, the more role models there are, and the more support there is, it's actually really important, which is why these conversations are so important.
Yeah, and Beth, you know, that just kind of I want to think about, like, are we doing enough, or what more could we do to kind of highlight the need for a queer affirmative stance from from health professionals? Like, clearly from what all of you have said, it's not enough, but I just wonder, is there a way to highlight this? Because it doesn't seem very top of mind, but to the medical professional community, or even like creating um, more energy or more voice or more support behind this, so any thoughts on what can be done to take this particular agenda forward? And we could start with you, Beth, since you touched upon it.
So I'm obviously not Indian, and I'm not a medical professional, so I think for me to kind of suggest things probably isn't appropriate, especially because I don't really know like the environment that you guys are operating in and how it is for you. All I can say really is that for someone like me, whose role it is to put people in touch with professionals, the more vocal, open people are about it, the more they write it on their website, the more they tweet, the easier it is for me to give people access. But I feel like I would defer to the others on specifics.
Yeah, I think no, and that's very fair. What I'd probably like to know from you, Beth, is how have you seen this kind of become an important part of the agenda, maybe in another country? Like, how has this been normalized? Maybe we learn a little bit from that experience, and then we can hear, Richa and Rishi's thoughts as well.
Sure. Well, just a few simple things that I've seen from medical professionals that I follow on Twitter, etc., like who focus on mental health issues. They might just put like the flag on their profile, or words about the fact they're an ally, or their pronouns, small things like that, that when you go on to their website or Twitter platform, you can see immediately that those, that person has thought about the fact that someone from the community might approach them. So I think even simple things like that, just putting your pronouns on your email or whatever it is, can really send a message. So sorry if that's a bit simple, but I just
that's important, right? Like the easiest things to do are often the hardest, because it's the mindset change. Like even just getting people to put the pronouns. I know we did this exercise in our organization, and initially it was like, why do we need to do it? Like everybody knows who I am. But even the simplest things, I think, have a lot of impact behind them. So that input is valuable as well. Rishi, what are your thoughts on this?
No, absolutely, I agree with that. There needs to be more advocacy. There needs to be more just an affirmative stance where you're actively sort of, so even in, for example, in like medical offices, having pamphlets or having material that is inclusive, that represents even same-sex relationships or transgender people, instead of having the typical heteronormative depiction. So I think these are very, very important factors to think about and to actively include in your sort of practice, whether you're a psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist or whatever field you're in, just to show that this is a safe space. But I think it also needs to go beyond, in the sense where when we look at the education and training, textbooks need to kind of change the way they are talking about all of these issues. And also something to be mindful of is that I feel like right now we're kind of in a space where being queer inclusive is also sort of the in thing to do, and a lot of people are claiming to be queer affirmative without really putting in that work of sort of understanding what queer realities are and what it's actually like to live in a homophobic family, or be part of a system where the kind of
Yeah.
discrimination and kind of stuff you have to face. So I think more training, specifically targeting these things, that building awareness into these very, very nuanced topics, I feel is very, I think, essential for anyone who's claiming to be queer affirmative.
Yep. Yep. Richa, your thoughts?
Yeah, there are a couple of things actually. So, all I pretty much agree with a lot with what Rishi mentioned, with what Beth mentioned. Like now, it has become a part of my practice. I'll be like, "Hi, my name is Richa Vashista. My pronouns are she and her." I obsessively put my pronouns, whichever platform I'm a part of, whether it's my email, whether it's my Instagram, a part of a Zoom meeting. So I think it's so important because it's not really about you, but it's about creating spaces for trans people, non-binary people, especially people who are in the closet, who would not be comfortable talking about pronouns, or not be comfortable with like boldly saying, hey, I'm not okay with the pronouns you just use for me. So I think it's so important that you do that as a part of your practice also. So I think as healthcare professionals, I think if we can relook at the way we do a basic case history taking or like an intake form, are we asking people their pronouns? Are we asking people about their sexuality and sexual orientation? Or are we just assuming that the person sitting in front of me is a heterosexual person? Also, a lot of things from a queer affirmative practitioner point of view, I think, is to kind of step out of this entire cisgender heteronormative norm and also stand up against phobia. So I think this is something that I do a lot in my practice. Is I can't always be neutral about any form of discrimination that's happening with my client, even though it might not be in my capacity to do something about it, but to kind of let my client know that, okay, this is actually discrimination or this is phobia. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier about how you need to have a social justice lens in the kind of work that you're doing, that people, for a lot of queer individuals, they're so used to this, they're just so used to it, they don't even realize sometimes it's passive discrimination that they might not realize. And I think as a professional, it is your responsibility to let them know. So I think these are a couple of points. I really do agree with using visual markers to show your allyship, whether it is a flag in your office or just having some informative materials, because I know that really does go a long way. And if there is a queer person sitting in that office space, they'll be like, okay, maybe this person's going to get me for a change based on all the experiences that I've had till now. So I think to start with, this is already a lot to do, I would say.
Yeah, no, that's a really good kind of agenda to have. I was also thinking if I could, get your views on if you had to identify maybe, because there's a lot that needs to be done, but like if you could, for each of you, what would be the maybe two or three things that one differentially focuses on, let's say over the next, say, 3 to 6 months, which will actually cause some kind of shift on ground, and like we said, those they could be small steps, because small steps often are the hardest to take, but like just from the lens of having a more equitable kind of community, or a future community where we can think about safe access to healthcare, mental, especially mental health, and then just like a more equitable uh, you know playing field in terms of rights, etc. What are some of the things that you think are the most important for individuals or organizations, or maybe society, sections of society, to think about? I'd love to get your views, and maybe Rishi, we could start with you.
Yeah, sure, sure. So this is something which I've actually put a lot of thought into, and um, I've been a very strong advocate of having comprehensive sexuality educations implemented across educational institutions, because I think that is actually the most important, in my view at least. I think that is the most important step we can take, because I think we everyone as we are developing, it's around puberty, around teenage, when you start kind of thinking about your sexuality, about your gender, about all of these things. And at that time, to just have there is such a lack of just even general sex ed right now. And comprehensive sexuality education is something that is actively promoted by the UN, and it talks more. It's not just basic sex ed. It is also talking about consent. It is also talking about um, how to say no, how to think about your own bodies, how to think about your boundaries, how to establish boundaries. I think that is, in my view, I think one of the most important things that actually should have been there a while ago, but it's something that needs to happen, so that people realize that this is another way to look at it. What the way we've been following is something that's actually discriminatory, that's oppressive. And I think that, and even after something like this is implemented, if and when it happens, I think it will also take time. I think it will take a decade for it to actually percolate, and for a societal shift to happen. but
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, I that's what I kind of feel very,
Yeah,
very.
no. Yeah, no, that's super important. I mean, just the whole sex education thing resonates so much because it's still something we, worry about addressing, be it, and it's not only in schools, even I've seen it with parents talking to their children about sexuality, or just even for that matter, sexual health, the things that you need to be aware of. It's just most people don't have that conversation, right? And a lot of parents I've also heard from is like, we don't know how to do this because nobody did it for us. We actually don't know how to address it. And even if there's a willingness, there's often not the right tools to, kind of, or just they don't know how to approach it. So I think that's a factor that really, resonates with me. Richa, what's your view?
Yeah, so I think a couple of points. So, what I realized a lot is that when we're looking at queer individuals in the country, पहले तो you start with them staying at home, so that's the first area. Second is educational institutions, so we're looking at schools and colleges, and let's say workspaces, and people where they finally go to work to. So I think when we're looking at spaces outside your home and creating safer spaces, inclusive spaces for LGBTQ people, I think the most simplest thing is, when I think about it, somebody would understand about their gender identity from as early as 7 years. So that's, that absolutely does happen. Now when this person goes into school and then goes into college, which washroom should they go to, right? Like, why is it on them to deal with all the bullying that comes after it? Like, I know washrooms is such a hotspot for bullying, for harassment. So I think if we can look at gender neutral washrooms to begin with, whether it's an educational institution or it is a workspace, that's the first thing. Second thing, I think it is also important to, and these are existing things, like you can absolutely do this right now. The most important second thing would be to relook at the policies that are also in place. So whether you're looking at an anti-bullying policy in schools, colleges, or you're looking at, an anti-discrimination policy at workspace, are these policies inclusive from a gender and sexuality lens? That's a question you need to ask yourself on, the people who are sitting behind these policies. So I think these are such important things, because that's where you can start addressing issues like discrimination, which is not really the responsibility on the queer person as to, how should they be assertive, how should, we deal with these kind of issues. So I think these are two important things. Other than that, if I have to add, maybe another thing would be to also introduce mental health cells, in schools, colleges, and workspaces, and make sure that these mental health cells have practitioners that are queer affirmative in nature. The other thing I know that also works for schools and colleges is LGBTQ support groups, where the students kind of start their own support group. Like, I know I'm very closely associated with IIT Bombay and their support group. It's called Sathi. So whenever they like to do something around mental health, we have a lot of conversations. So I know that, okay, now in something like an IIT Bombay, there are a group of queer individuals, and even if there are people in the closet, they at least know that, okay, if at all I want to reach out to somebody, here is where I can go. So I
Yeah.
think these are some really important points to start with.
Yeah. No, and I think that's that resonates so much because back in the day I remember somebody came to me and said we need a gender neutral washroom, and this is like about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was like, why? Like, what's the need for a gender neutral bathroom? And when they actually sat down and explained it to me, it made so much sense, and we, got that in place very quickly. But like, just without the education, I was like, what does that even mean? Why would you need it? And so I think that's very, it's a very important point. On your other point, I also have kind of started seeing organizations and a lot of the undergrad and postgrad schools putting in place affiliation groups for awareness and support. But I do think there's a pretty gaping hole on the school level where especially when you're actually hitting puberty, and where the whole realization might actually come much earlier than it would previously. I think that support specifically in that area is very lacking. So maybe something to actually think about and generate a lot more confidence, comfort, and safe space in a place where kids who are anyway so confused around their teenage years to
Right.
have that support. Beth, especially with the work that you do with organizations, I'd love to get your view on this as well.
Sure, yeah. I was just going to pick up on what you just said, and actually Rishi's point before around the importance of talking about this when you're young. Just like a personal story. So I was really lucky. My mum was actually a school nurse, and she one of her roles was to talk about sex ed in schools. That was like her job. So I was brought up in a really open household, and I have to say that has really affected me through my life. And compared to my peers growing up, I was always so much more open and like in the know about all issues from sexuality, gender, etc. People used to ask me, about things, and I used to tell them, and I never found it taboo or awkward or anything. Of course, that's where I'm from. That was my experience, but I just think it's so important that whoever that adult is, for me, it was my mum. There does need to be someone who can support those young people. Otherwise, it must just be a minefield. I can't imagine what it must be like. That's not to say I never got confused and things, because obviously I did, but I was very lucky. In terms of what more we can do, what's the kind of priority? For me, I think maximising the digital space is super important. I know there are challenges, but there are huge opportunities around like equitable access for people, affordability of things. Obviously, there's like a positive and negative slant to that. Like, professionals need to make money, of course they do, but there is more access to resources online for people who can't afford to see a professional maybe right now. So I think we need to be clever about how we use the digital space. We need to think of new innovative ways of getting our messages out, whilst making sure people aren't left behind. So I would say digital is key.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I am conscious of time and, know that, we need to wind up shortly. But just before that, I'd love to hear from all three of you about maybe an experience that you had in the last, couple of months, which kind of highlights the bunch of stuff that we've spoken about, right? Whether it is just the approach to mental health, from the perspective of a healthcare professional, a doctor, a psychiatrist, could be just an individual you saw kind of caught up in this whole COVID situation and unable to deal with, that you supported, or maybe just a story of support that you'd like to share before we wrap up. Because for me personally, everything that we've just spoken about has been immensely helpful. And as I said, I was approaching this as a newbie compared to all of you, and just the different perspectives are important for me as we think about our approach to this community, which I feel like is, we give it a lot of importance in our people agenda. And these have been just very valuable for me to think about. So if it's okay with you, I'd love for each of you to share a story before we end.
I'd be happy to start.
Yeah, Richa, please go for it. Thank you so much.
All right. So I think, one thing that I realized during the pandemic, keeping queer individuals in mind, is that earlier people had an opportunity to be seen, to be heard, right? And it's so important because it somehow helps you validate your sexuality, your gender identity. And that became a huge issue because you're at home right now, and you might not really get the opportunity to be seen and heard. And something that I started doing a lot in my practice was validating my clients' experiences, validating my clients' identity, helping them deal with or face dysphoria that they have been experiencing. So for a lot of trans people, it would be okay. You are in an unsafe environment, and you probably cannot wear, so if you're looking at a trans man and their parents are like, oh chani, you cannot be wearing shirts, you need to be wearing kurtas, for example. And that can really create a lot of physical dysphoria. So I remember helping a lot of these clients and supporting them by telling them, okay, how about you go to the washroom and wear a shirt for a while, and like just sit there and like consider that as your safe space in that moment, when nobody is going to stop you, nobody is going to question you. And unfortunately, of course, you'll have to step out of the space and then get into the real world, which would be amongst queer phobic parents in that moment. But that is a small way of how a trans person could validate their own identity, um, fight this dysphoria that they're feeling on a daily level. I know so many people have been finding it difficult to even look into the mirror, so I've been telling a lot of people, don't look into the mirror, it's okay. So you're
Mm,
finding it difficult because you've not been able to go for a haircut, you're not being able to recognize yourself. No problem, don't look into the mirror. Look back at older photos where you can remember that, okay, this is who I am, this is my identity. Look back at older photos. Social media is usually full of these photographs, memories. Look at that and try to create like an emotional safe space for yourself. So yeah, that's something that I'm really doing a lot during this time, to kind of offer any kind of support. So you could do this with your friends and family. You could also offer this kind of information to your friends and family who are queer, who are finding it really difficult to deal with the current pandemic.
yeah, no, that's super important. I love the mirror, the mirror example, because that, like, I think even for a lot of us, right, like it just gets to us beyond a point, especially in the peak of the lockdown. You are often like, what are you? You're doing dishes, you're cooking, you're doing housework, you're doing your work, and you suddenly don't have an outlet to really express who you are. So
Yeah.
I think I love that point
In
really.
fact, you
Thanks for
reminded
sharing.
me of another thing. So there's this non-binary client who was assigned female at birth. They kept telling me that they don't have a problem with doing the dishes, or they don't have a problem with doing housework, but the parent kept asking them to do it because they're assigned female at birth. And as per the parent, this is your duty. You need to be doing things, even though there's a brother in the house. And that again adds to this person's dysphoria and
Yeah.
makes it really difficult for them to survive on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks. That's a wonderful story, Richa. Thank you for sharing. Rishi, anything you'd like to share?
Yes. So I won't go into examples of people I've come across, but something that I have been sort of really finding it very difficult to understand. And when I look at discrimination, as a whole, um, it's just, it's very sad that people have to fight so much and struggle so much just to be who they are. It's not just to, I mean,
Absolutely.
the kind of discrimination and oppression they have to face for, it doesn't matter. I mean, I think the labels or the identities vary, whether it is, we're looking at the Black Lives Matter movement that's happening globally, we're looking at whether it's a trans person, whether it is a gay person. Regardless of your identity, it is just a struggle to just exist as who you are. And I feel like that's a very I don't know how to feel about that. That's a very
Yeah.
sort of difficult thing to grapple with for me personally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, and add the overlay of this whole situation where we're all feeling
Absolutely.
fairly isolated,
Yeah.
and you have a perfect storm, which is why the whole focus on mental health is just so important in this. Beth, any stories from you?
Just a quick thought linked to what Rishi just said. I think one thing I've learned is not to make assumptions, and that's important anyway. But I think at the start of COVID, anytime I spoke to someone, I assumed they were scared about getting COVID. But actually, mostly people's worries and concerns were not that. They were much broader than that. Maybe family, job, lack of access to support, things that they enjoy doing that gives them satisfaction or enjoyment that they can't do anymore. Play sport, go to the cinema. So I've learned that not to make assumptions and to just really listen to people and to understand the specifics of what they're going through. That's my main takeaway.
Yep. No, thank you. And that's really goes back to the age-old saying that no individual, I'm not going to say man or woman, is an island. So and we all need support, irrespective of what our gender, what our sexual identity, preferences, etc. We all need support. And I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you to the Keshav Suri Foundation for providing us this platform to do the discussion. And as I said, I've certainly learned a lot. I've been furiously taking notes. I don't know if you could see, but there's a lot of food for thought, that I've gained from your time. So thank you so much for taking it, taking out that time and sharing things in a very kind of balanced perspective, which is super important. And thank you, and I look forward to being in touch even after this discussion.